Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video in my ongoing read-along of Bleak House. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a long-term serialised Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens's Bleak House. So basically we read the book over 18 months in the original monthly serialised parts that it was originally published in. So we're just a little way over halfway through now, which is insane to think. I think we should finish up in September of this year, apparently. So today I'm going to be talking about the chapters we read in the month of December. I am a little bit behind, I'm sorry about this. December was just a very busy month, but hopefully I will get a little bit more on track now into 2019 and get more into a rhythm for so. Today I'm going to be talking about those three chapters we read in the month of December, which were Chapter 30, Esther's Narrative, Chapter 31, Nurse and Patient, and Chapter 32, The Appointed Time. So plenty to discuss today. As usual, I'm going to do a quick summary of what happens in each chapter, and then I will talk about some of the points of interest. I feel like these chapters are quite plot heavy rather than theme heavy, so I'm not sure how much I'm going to have to say, but we shall see. I usually find stuff to say in these videos, don't I? Usually when it's Dickens, I can find some stuff to say. So, Chapter 30, Esther's Narrative. Relatively near the start of this chapter, Mrs. Woodcourt, Mr. Woodcourt's mother, comes to stay with them. And while staying with Esther and Mr. Jarndyce and Ada, she drops a lot of hints to Esther about how, one, how wonderful her son is, but two, how her son is from a high birth family and therefore would have to marry someone of high birth, and therefore just extra hinting Esther not to get any ideas above your station, which makes Esther feel very uncomfortable, but also she feels like the fact that it makes her feel uncomfortable is bad and immodest because she shouldn't be thinking that Mr. Woodcourt might consider marrying her anyway. Anyway, after Mrs. Woodcourt has gone, the Caddy comes to see them and says that her and Prince are going to be married in just a month's time, and she really wants Esther and Ada to come and be her bridesmaids, which they do. So Caddy comes to stay with them for a few weeks. They help her kind of make clothes and get everything ready for her wedding, and then Ada and Esther and Mr. Jarndyce go to Caddy's wedding, which is a slightly crazy affair because both her and Prince have one eccentric parent. Mrs. Jellyby and Mr. Turveydrop are both so over the top and so thoroughly Dickensian, and poor Mr. Jellyby, Caddy's father, is very sad to lose her but also worries for her happiness because his married life has not been great. And that is pretty much what happens in this chapter. So let's look back on some points of interest here. Firstly, I want to talk a bit about Esther's personality and her modesty and the kind of the way Mrs. Woodcourt makes her feel uncomfortable, because I think it's really sad to know by this point that Esther is probably at least a little bit in love with Mr. Woodcourt, or if not like a little bit in love. She liked Mr. Woodcourt a lot. Mr. Woodcourt has gone away to be a surgeon at sea to try and make something of himself. Esther being always modest and retiring, and also feeling that because of her birth and background, marriage is to a certain extent out of reach for her, or at least a bit more complicated for her. Therefore, she has decided that Mr. Woodcourt couldn't possibly have ever admired her. But Mrs. Woodcourt's hints about the fact that she wouldn't be a good enough wife for Mr. Woodcourt make her feel very uncomfortable because it's mean, but also make her feel uncomfortable because she kind of agrees, but also it's therefore horrible to hear, and also kind of feeds into her general kind of self-doubt and lack of confidence. It's interesting to watch her like confusion in her writing. We know this is a retrospective narrative, but Esther tries to like explain exactly how she felt at the time, and you get a good sense of her like narrative unreliability and her kind of modesty and doubt and confusion about this. She says that there is something about Mrs. Woodcourt that she found irksome. I don't know what it was, or at least if I do now, I thought I did not then, or at least but it don't matter. Interesting that she doesn't say, I didn't know then what it was that bothered me. She says, I thought I did not know. I feel like Esther is always trying to make sure her surface consciousness is always like as good and modest as possible, whereas like in her subconscious she might know. And when Mrs. Woodcourt keeps on talking about her family's past, it was in vain for me to try to change the subject as I used to try, only for the sake of novelty, or perhaps because I need not be so particular. Mrs. Woodcourt never would let me change it. Mrs. Woodcourt, in order to try and deflect what she views as Esther's potential interest in her son, gives her lots of not so gentle hints. One about the fact that Mr. Woodcourt needs a wife of good birth, also about the fact that Mr. Woodcourt is a flirt, which is definitely, well, that's not the impression I received of him, although I'm also aware that Mr. Woodcourt we don't actually see that much in this book, and that my impression of Mr. Woodcourt I know is like built slightly from the television adaptation, so I have to be like really careful whenever I'm analysing Mr. Woodcourt, because Esther is at pains to like not talk about him too much because she slightly fancies him and doesn't want to say. Therefore, like we only see Mr. Woodcourt in like fits and starts, and often like he's just mentioned that he was there at the end of a chapter. And Mrs. Woodcourt also predicts that Esther is going to marry someone very rich and very worthy, much older than herself, i.e. not her son, Mr. Woodcourt. It was curious that this should make me uncomfortable, but I think it did. I know it did. It made me for some part of that night quite uncomfortable. I was so ashamed of my folly that I did not like to confess it even to Ada. It's really sad because when she says she was ashamed of her folly, she doesn't just mean that she's ashamed that Mrs. Woodcourt's speeches make her uncomfortable because she feels like she shouldn't feel that they relate to her. She's also kind of ashamed at what she views as her folly of having been attracted to Mr. Woodcourt in the first place, which just makes me sad. Anyway, let's move on to Caddy and the wedding. One thing I want to talk about here is Mr. Jellyby as a character, because Mr. Jellyby as a character is not fully developed really until this point, I would say. He's usually silent, he's usually in the room, he's just kind of Mrs. Jellyby's poor, you know, neglected husband. But in this chapter, I think you get a much stronger sense of him. Caddy says to Esther that what her father has said to him on announcing that she is going to be married: "My poor girl, you have not been very well taught how to make a home for your husband, but unless you mean with all your heart to strive to do it, you had better murder him than marry him if you really love him." I used that last sentence as one of the chapter headings of my dissertation at university. I'm just going to tell you this now because I really like this quote. Whenever I read it, it makes me smile because I think of my dissertation. In my dissertation, it was on how the presentation of gender changes over time throughout Charles Dickens's novels from like his early to his late. And I had one chapter on like the physicality of gender, so like how people behave physically, beauty and kind of displays of emotion and things like that. I had one chapter on gender and marriage, I had one chapter on gender and work and duty, and I had one chapter on gender and morality. Maybe sometime I should do a video like going through my undergrad dissertation and what I did on. Would people be interested in that? My chapter in my dissertation that was on marriage, the quote I had for my chapter title was, "You had better murder him than marry him if you really love him," which made me laugh. Anyway, it's interesting to see that Caddy's father is not worried that she won't be happy with Prince because of Prince, but she's worried that Prince and her might not be happy together because of how unhappy his wife has made him, because he worries Caddy will not know enough about housekeeping, which is, you know, quite gendered and quite interesting in terms of how it's gendered, but also I think you do get a sense of his misery with his wife and how complicated their marriage has been and how, you know, she has financially ruined him in some ways as well, so he probably does have the right to be rather annoyed. She has both financially and kind of like emotionally ruined him. Esther says at one point that she thinks Mr. Jellyby had been more talkative and lively once, but he seemed to have been completely exhausted long before I knew him. And there's one point at the end of this chapter where he goes up to Esther to like try and express his thanks and gratitude for her friendship to Caddy, and he just like opens his mouth twice and can't say anything, and then that's just all. And you can kind of tell that he's been slightly broken by being married to Mrs. Jellyby. I'm not going to talk too much about Mrs. Jellyby as a character here because I feel like I've dwelt upon her quite a lot as we've gone through the book. She is a very interesting character. On one hand, she is very dislikable and is quite cruel and neglectful to her children, and I find like especially her attitude towards Caddy's wedding slightly a bit mean, in that basically she's like, "Oh, it's so stupid to think of Caddy being married, because who would want to marry Caddy? I'm sure she is getting married, but I don't really care," which is not a very nice attitude to have towards your daughter's wedding. However, I do always find it really interesting that Mrs. Jellyby's and the criticism kind of levelled against her are always kind of quite gendered, as in fact are the criticisms that Dickens levels at Mr. Turveydrop, Prince's father. Prince's father makes his son do all the work and kind of appears purely for decoration, which is like typically considered a kind of female thing in the Victorian period. Mrs. Jellyby has kind of neglected her family to work, which is something that is considered fairly kind of male in the Victorian period. So this is interesting, but I've talked about this before, so we don't need to go into it here. But I will just highlight one passage about the messy household, the new lodgings that the Jellybys have. I believe that nothing belonging to the family which it had been possible to break was unbroken at the time of those preparations for Caddy's marriage, and nothing which it had been possible to spoil in any way was unspoilt, and that no domestic object which was capable of collecting dirt from a dear child's knee to the door plate was without as much dirt as could possibly accumulate on it. Although it's interesting to note that although Mrs. Jellyby doesn't take Caddy's wedding very seriously, she does say to her when they part, "Go along, I am excellent friends with you. Now goodbye, Caddy, and be very happy." And you get the suggestion that even if she's not taking it seriously, she does on some level wish her daughter happy. I think that's all I want to say on this chapter, and we'll go on to chapter 31, Nurse and Patient. At the beginning of this chapter, Esther's young maid, Charlie, tells her that she has seen Jenny and Liz, the brickmakers' wives who we encountered earlier, and that with them is a young boy who's very, very ill. And Charlie, thinking especially of her little brother, is really worried about this boy, and so her and Esther go off to see the brickmakers' wives and the boy, who turns out, of course, to be the crossing sweeper boy Joe, who we've encountered several times before. When they get there, they meet Joe, who immediately mistakes Esther for Lady Dedlock, who previously asked him to show her around the burial ground where Mr. Nemo / Horden used to live. We know by this point that Lady Dedlock is Esther's mother. So Jo is very, very ill and has a bad fever. Esther and Charlie want to help them as much as they can. Jenny and Liz tell them that their husbands will not stand Jo being there and that they don't know how to help him. So Esther and Caddy help take Jo back to their house. When they get him back to the house and show Mr. Jarndyce the boy, Harold Skimpole, who is staying there, suggests that they turn him out into the street because Harold Skimpole is not a nice man. We'll talk about this more in a second. Mr. Jarndyce, however, wants to help Jo, and so they decide to give him a bed for the night and see what can be done for him in the morning. But when they wake up, Jo has clean off vanished. He is gone from the house and no one knows where he is gone. And then a few days later, Charlie falls ill with the fever Jo had. Esther nurses Charlie as best she can, but just when Charlie is coming back to health herself, Esther also falls very, very ill. She is desperate to keep Ada away from her because she doesn't want Ada to get the fever as well. The illness that they have, by the way, I'm fairly sure it's smallpox. It's certainly, I don't think it's named in this chapter. I'm not sure if it's named in the future, but I do believe that it is smallpox. And at the very end of the chapter, Esther is in fact so unwell that she has lost her vision and she is blind, and that's how we end the chapter and leave Esther for this part. So there's a lot happening in this chapter and quite a lot to talk about. I want to first talk a little bit about the kind of social criticism around Jo and his illness. Our society has kind of, if not conspired to make him ill, has severely kind of limited his ability to try and help himself. At one point, Mr. Jarndyce says that if Jo were a prisoner, he'd be able to get into a hospital, but as just a free, poor boy, the hospitals won't take him, and how kind of awful that is. Jo talks about his illness and he says, I'm being froze and then burnt up and then froze and then burnt up ever so many times in an hour, and my head's all sleepy and all are going mad, like I'm so dry and my bones isn't half so much bones as pain. I've been moved on and moved on more nor ever I was before since t'other one give me a sovereign. Mrs. Snagsby, she's always a watching and a driving me. What have I done to her? And they're all a watching and a driving of me. Every one of them's doing it, from the time when I don't get up to the time when I don't go to bed and I'm a-going somewheres. There's where I'm a-going. She told me down in Tom Allalone's as she come from Stolburns, and so I took the Stolburns roads. It's as good as another. So we know from here that Jo is moving on and moving on, that he's not allowed to stay in one place because kind of police are moving him on, but also because of this mystery he's mixed up in. Mrs. Snagsby and Mr. Tulkinghorn seems to have given Jo problems, which mean that he is not allowed to stay in one place, he doesn't get better, and he's got this kind of illness. And there's also a slight mystery around the way that he disappears as well, which suggests not everything is quite right with Jo. Jo says that he doesn't need shelter, he can lay down amongst the warm bricks. But don't you know that people die there, returned Charlie. They dies everywhere, said the boy. They dies in their lodgings, she knows where, I showed her, and they dies down in Tom Allalone's in heaps. They dies more than they lives, according to what I see. Which is just, I don't know, I think that's one of the like saddest sentences in all of Bleak House. And that kind of strong social criticism that Dickens is getting across, the way so many very poor people are just ignored in Victorian society and just left to die anywhere and everywhere. It's just terrible. Jo is a really interesting character, but he is also very much a symbol of someone who has been forsaken by society and what that means for that person. I quickly want to mention as well the character of Charlie in this. It's interesting to see in this whole chapter how Charlie is exceptionally clever and exceptionally efficient. She's very, very good at like knowing what to do in every situation, acting fast, but also we learn at the very beginning of this chapter that she's terrible at reading and writing and she really, really struggles. So it's interesting to see how Dickens kind of explores different forms of intelligence, which I know he's looked at a bit before with Esther. Esther says that she's not clever, but we also see how like emotionally intelligent she is and how efficient and organised she is as well throughout this. And now let's talk about Mrs. Skimpole, shall we? Who I detest. I think this is one of the moments in this book where you see how awful Mr. Skimpole is, because he basically says, this boy has a fever, I don't want to get a fever, chuck him out of the house, because Mr. Skimpole has no heart, and he may consider himself a child, but actually he's just a thoroughly, thoroughly selfish man, and I think that is the point, and I think this is one of those moments where Dickens is giving you big alarm bells of maybe Mr. Skimpole is not so innocent as he seems, especially because it's almost something worse about someone like being horrible and being like awfully cruel and pretending that they just don't understand these kind of things. He says to Mr. Jarndyce, therefore I recommend you turning him out before he gets still worse. And Esther says, the amiable face with which he said it, I think I shall never forget. He looks cheerful and easy all the while he is suggesting that they leave this poor boy to die. And I think it's important too that Esther, Mr. Jarndyce, Ada and Charlie all have such great sympathy for Jo, and also that we learn shortly after Mrs. Skimpole's speech here that all of the servants of the house are all like really concerned and trying to help Jo as much as they can, and Mrs. Skimpole is literally the only person who's just like, oh, I don't care, because he is horrible. I want to talk a little bit about illness before we move on to the next chapter. Firstly, just to say it must have been awful to be ill in the Victorian period. But also I think it's very interesting to see how Charlie and Esther both deal with their illnesses. Both of them are quite self-sacrificing, and Charlie, in many ways, you can see how she is kind of modelling herself on Esther in kind of her efficiency and organisation, and emotional intelligence seems quite like Esther. And you get the impression that she is learning from Esther, but also at the same time, while Charlie is ill, the kind of patience she has, Esther also feels like she is learning from Charlie, and when she becomes ill, she is determined to be as patient as Charlie was. Both of them are kind of more distressed by the other's illness than they are by their own, which is quite touching, really. And also the fact that when Esther is ill, more than anything, more than her own illness, more than knowing what is happening to her and not knowing what the future might be, whether or not she will live, knowing that she, at the end of this chapter, has gone blind, her biggest concern still is to make sure Ada doesn't get in the room and to make sure Ada doesn't get ill, because she cares so much about Ada and she's so worried about her, and that's like her main worry. It's really interesting and it's very touching as well, and I find this whole bit very sad. Now Charlie, when she knows I'm ill, she will try to make her way into the room. Keep her out, Charlie, if you love me truly to the last. Charlie, if you let her in but once, only to look upon me for one moment as I lie here, I shall die. I never will, she promised me. I believe it, my dear Charlie, and now come and sit beside me for a little while and touch me with your hand, for I cannot see you, Charlie, I am blind. On to chapter 32, The Appointed Time. Is this perhaps the most disgusting, horrible chapter in all of Dickens? It's pretty... It's pretty grim. Okay, let's talk about what happens in this chapter. We encounter Mr. Weevil slash Mr. Jobling, who is a friend of Mr. Guppy, who is staying currently at Krook's shop, and he has arranged with Krook that he shall take from Krook some letters, the letters that were written and presumably from Lady Dedlock to Captain Horden, otherwise known as Mr. Nemo, which Guppy then intends to deliver up to Lady Dedlock, as we have seen him tell Lady Dedlock in previous chapters. Mr. Jobling goes out into the street where he meets Mr. Snagsby, and both of them remark on the terrible weather, how it smells like burning, and how there's lots of dust and fat in the air. Mr. Guppy then comes along, and him and Mr. Jobling go back to his room to discuss the letters. They also discuss how everything smells like burning and how the air is really disgusting tonight, and how there's like weird, horrible stuff on the windowsill. And then they go down at 12 o'clock, the appointed time, to meet Mr. Krook and to get the letters from him, and find that Mr. Krook has spontaneously combusted. The reason why the air is horrible and the smell of burning is not from chops, it's from Mr. Krook burning, and also everything in the air is like atoms of Mr. Krook. It's really horrible. Now, spontaneous combustion is not possible, but Dickens very much believed it was. He had an argument with George Henry Lewes, who was a critic and also the partner of George Eliot, and George Henry Lewes was like, that's clearly not possible, to which Dickens then added a new note in his preface of the book, that he had purposefully dwelt on the romantic side of familiar things. And he also adds to that preface a long description of various other accounts of spontaneous combustion. Basically the idea is that Mr. Krook, because he is an alcoholic, has drunk so much alcoholic liquid that it has made a fire inside him that has led him to combust, which is very unpleasant. This is like the closest to horror almost that Dickens gets, except that it's like so ridiculous and gross and horrible because there are atoms of Mr. Krook in the air, like, oh, and they think it smells of chops and it's really greasy. That's the word Mr. Snagsby uses. The air is greasy, and it's greasy because Mr. Krook has spontaneously combusted. Anyway, it is gross, but it's also like, it's really powerful in many ways, I think, especially if you think that it was kind of believed that this was possible to happen in the Victorian period, though unlikely, and that it is so dark and grim that this horrible, mad shop, this is the end of Mr. Krook. And of course the title of this chapter, The Appointed Time, is the appointed time of Mr. Krook's death, as well as the appointed time of collecting the letters. This is what the characters say about the terrible weather slash environment. Jobling says, there's not much air to be got here, and what it is, it's not very refreshing. Mr. Snagsby observes that, you're rather greasy here, sir. Why, I have noticed myself that there is a queer kind of flavour in the place tonight. Mr. Weevil rejoins, I suppose it's chops at the Soul's Arms. Chops, you think? Oh, chops, eh? Mr. Snagsby sniffs and tastes again. Well, sir, I suppose it is, but I should say their cook at the Soul wanted a little looking after. She has been burning 'em, sir. I don't think, not to put too fine a point on it, that they were quite fresh when they were shown the gridiron. That's very likely. It's a tainting sort of weather. It is a tainting sort of weather, says Mr. Snagsby, and I find it sinking to the spirits. By George, I find it gives me the horrors. And later Guppy says, why, Tony, what on earth is going on in this house tonight? Is there a chimney on fire? See how the soot's falling. See here on my arm. See again on that table there. Confound the stuff, it won't blow off. Smears like black fat. And then I want to read a little bit of when they go down to the shop. I feel like there's not too much to discuss in this chapter except spontaneous combustion. They go down, more dead than alive, and holding one another, push open the door of the back shop. The cat has retreated close to it and stands snarling, not at them, at something on the ground before the fire. There is very little fire left in the grate, but there is a smouldering, suffocating vapour in the room and a dark, greasy coating on the walls and ceiling. The chairs and table and the bottle so rarely absent from the table all stand as usual. On one back chair hang the old man's hairy cap and coat. Mr. Jobling says, "I told you so. When I saw him last, he took his cap off, took out the little bundle of old letters, hung his cap on the back of the chair. His coat was there already, for he had pulled that off before he went to put up the shutters. And I left him turning over the letters in his hands, standing just where that crumpled black thing is upon the floor." They advance slowly, looking at all these things. The cat remains where they found her, still snarling at the something on the ground between the fire and the two chairs. What is it? Hold up the light. Here is a small burnt patch of flooring. Here is the tinder from a little bundle of burnt paper, but not so light as usual, seeming to be steeped in something. And here is it the cinder of a small charred or broken log of wood sprinkled with white ashes? Or is it coal? Oh horror, he is here, and this from which we run away, striking out the light and overturning one another into the street, is all that represents him. Help, 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 come into this house for heaven's sake. Plenty will come, but none can help. The Lord Chancellor of that court, true to his title in his last act, has died the death of all Lord Chancellors in all courts, of all authorities in one place under all names soever, where false pretences are made and where injustice is done. Call the death by any name your highness will, attribute it to whom you will, or say it might have been prevented how you will. It is the same eternity, inborn, inbred, endangered in the corrupted humours of the vicious body itself, and that only spontaneous combustion, and none other of all the deaths that can be died. Lots of interesting things in these final two paragraphs here I want to unpack. First is the perspective shift that occurs here, which I really like. I always like it when Dickens addresses the audience or suddenly embodies, he suddenly says he is here and this from which we run away. It's suddenly that author is becoming Guppy and Jobling, and also kind of becoming everyone who kind of comes to try and help and sees Mr. Krook on the ground. I also think it's interesting that Dickens here draws attention to Mr. Krook's nickname being the Lord Chancellor, the suggestion being that Mr. Krook kind of spontaneously combusting is some kind of symbol of how, court cases and courts kind of spontaneously combust, and the idea that, corruption in Mr. Krook being the corruption of the alcohol in his body leads to death and disaster in other Lord Chancellors, not just in Mr. Krook, if that makes sense, which I find really interesting. So I think that's all I had to say about those chapters. Quite an interesting set of chapters we read in December. In the month of January, which I know is pretty well underway, we are currently reading chapter 33, Interlopers, chapter 34, A Turn of the Screw, and chapter 35, Esther's Narrative. Exciting chapters to carry on with in January. I know I'm running a bit late, but as I said, hopefully I will get back probably into this now, and the January video should be up fairly soon. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of December's chapters of Bleak House, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.